It was the summer of 2006, and I was on a cross-country road trip to clear my head after graduating college. Driving through the open highways of the Midwest, I felt an incredible sense of freedom. The radio crackled with static as I lost reception in the middle of nowhere. With only the hum of my car engine and the rhythmic beat of my tires against the asphalt, I welcomed the solitude. I was somewhere between Kansas and Nebraska, a long, barren stretch of road surrounded by endless cornfields. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the world in deep hues of purple and orange. My plan was to drive until I reached the next town, but as darkness enveloped the landscape, I began to reconsider. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the side of the road, illuminated by the faint glow of my headlights. A young woman, probably in her mid-20s, wearing a light blue dress that fluttered in the evening breeze. Her long blonde hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and she clutched a small, battered suitcase. I slowed the car, debating whether to stop. Hitchhikers weren't uncommon in this part of the country, and she looked harmless enough. My gut told me to keep driving, but my conscience got the better of me. I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the road. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. She climbed into the passenger seat, placing her suitcase carefully at her feet. Up close, I noticed how pale she was, almost ghostly, and her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her seatbelt. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness of the road swallowing us whole. I tried to make small talk, asking her name and where she was headed. She told me her name was Emily, and she was trying to get home to see her family. There was something off about her, though. Her answers were vague, and she avoided eye contact, staring out the window instead. "Do you live nearby?" I asked, trying to fill the quiet. "Yes," she said after a pause. "Just a little farther." Her response didn't ease my growing unease. Something about her felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The air in the car felt heavy, charged with an inexplicable tension. About 20 minutes later, Emily suddenly spoke. "You need to turn left up ahead," she said, her voice urgent. I glanced at her, confused. "There's nothing out here." "Please," she insisted. "It's the only way." Against my better judgment, I complied. The road veered off into a dirt path that cut through the cornfields, the headlights casting eerie shadows on the tall stalks. Emily sat rigid in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice betraying my nerves. "Yes," she whispered. The path twisted and turned, becoming narrower with each passing mile. My unease grew with every bump and rattle of the car. Suddenly, Emily reached out and grabbed my arm, her grip icy cold. "Stop," she said sharply. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Emily opened the door and stepped out, her suitcase in hand. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "Wait," I called after her. "Are you sure you're okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she disappeared into the cornfields, the stalks swaying in her wake. I sat there for a moment, stunned, before deciding to follow her. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the night. The cornfields were eerily quiet, the only sound my footsteps crunching on the dry dirt. "Emily." I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. I ventured deeper into the field, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dense stalks. That's when I saw it, her suitcase, abandoned in the dirt. It was old and battered, the latches barely holding it together. I knelt down and opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of the same young woman. But she wasn't smiling. In every photo, her face was etched with fear, her eyes wide with terror. My stomach churned as I realized the woman in the pictures was Emily. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. "Help me." I spun around, my heart pounding. The cornfields seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." I ran back to the car, my pulse racing. As I reached the road, I glanced back at the cornfields one last time. Standing at the edge was Emily, her pale figure barely visible in the moonlight. Her eyes locked onto mine, and her lips parted as if to speak. But before she could, she vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until I reached the nearest town, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I told myself it was all in my head, a trick of the darkness and my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The next morning, I stopped at a diner to grab coffee and clear my head. I mentioned the incident to the waitress, hoping she could offer some logical explanation. Her face went pale as I described Emily. "You're not the first," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People see her sometimes, always hitchhiking on that same stretch of road. They say she was murdered out there years ago, trying to get home." I left the diner in a daze, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I haven't driven that road since, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Emily. I wonder if she's still out there, wandering the cornfields, waiting for someone to help her find her way home. It was late fall, and I was driving home after visiting my brother in a small town a few hours from the city. I had underestimated how quickly the days were getting shorter, and by the time I was halfway home, the sun had already set, leaving the highway in total darkness. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the pitch-black night and the occasional glow of passing cars. I had been driving for about 2 hours when I saw him. He was standing by the side of the road, his arm outstretched, thumb up. The man wore a dark jacket, the hood pulled low over his face, and a small duffel bag rested by his feet. Normally, I wouldn't have stopped, especially not at night. But something about him seemed desperate. I couldn't just leave him there in the freezing cold. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" I called out. He nodded, his face still obscured by the shadows of his hood. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and raspy. As he climbed into the passenger seat, I caught a whiff of something metallic, like rust or blood. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the cold air or maybe his old jacket. He set his bag on the floor and buckled his seatbelt. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just down the road," he said, his answer vague. I nodded and kept driving. The silence in the car was heavy, the only sound the hum of the engine and the faint static from the radio. The man sat stiffly in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He didn't say much, and every time I glanced at him, he seemed to be staring straight ahead, unmoving. About 20 minutes into the drive, I started to feel uneasy. There was something off about him, his rigid posture, his silence, the way he seemed to avoid looking at me. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I tried to keep my focus on the road. "You traveling far?" I asked, hoping to break the tension. "Not too far," he replied, his voice monotone. I nodded again, feeling the awkwardness grow. As the minutes dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even though he never turned his head. It was as if his presence filled the entire car, suffocating me with an unspoken weight. Suddenly, he spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice so low I almost didn't hear him. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hood still obscuring his face. The metallic smell grew stronger, filling the car. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't coming from his jacket, it was coming from him. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "Are you okay?" I asked, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. "I'm fine," he said, but his tone was anything but reassuring. The road stretched on endlessly, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread, like something was about to happen. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There was someone in the back seat. A shadowy figure sat behind me, their face hidden in the darkness. My chest tightened as I struggled to keep the car steady. I hadn't heard anyone get in. I hadn't stopped since picking up the hitchhiker. How was that possible? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to look back, to confirm what I'd seen, but fear rooted me in place. Instead, I focused on the road, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my mind playing tricks on me. But then the figure moved. A low whisper filled the car, a voice I didn't recognize. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. I clenched my teeth, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Who are you?" I blurted out, unable to contain my fear any longer. The hitchhiker didn't respond. He sat perfectly still, as if he hadn't heard me. But the voice in the back seat came again, louder this time. "Turn around." I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the empty highway. My breathing was ragged as I turned in my seat, shining the beam of my phone's flashlight into the back seat. It was empty. The hitchhiker didn't react to my outburst. He just sat there, his hands still clasped in his lap. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "There was someone back there," I said, my voice trembling. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. "No one's here but us." I stared at him, my skin crawling. "I think you need to get out," I said, my voice firm despite my fear. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his hood slipping just enough to reveal a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they didn't look human. They were dark and hollow, like endless voids. I didn't wait for him to argue. I threw the car into park, unbuckled my seatbelt, and jumped out, my heart racing. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I backed away from the car, keeping my eyes on the hitchhiker. He didn't follow me. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield. And then, without warning, he reached for the door handle and stepped out. But when I looked again, he was gone. I blinked, my breath visible in the frosty air. The road was empty. There was no sign of him or his duffel bag. It was as if he had never been there at all. Shaking, I climbed back into the car and locked the doors. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the safety of my driveway. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. To this day, I don't know what I picked up that night. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I catch a faint whiff of that metallic smell. And in the rearview mirror, just for a split second, I think I see him sitting there, waiting for another ride. It was the summer of 2013, and I had just finished a weekend camping trip with a few friends in the remote mountains of Northern California. The trip had been amazing, clear skies, campfires, and the kind of peace you can only find miles away from civilization. By Sunday evening, everyone else had already packed up and left, but I decided to stay a little longer, savoring the quiet before heading back to the city. As the sun began to set, I realized I had lingered too long. The narrow, winding roads through the forest were hard enough to navigate during the day, and I wasn't thrilled about driving them in the dark. I quickly threw my gear into the back seat and started my car, determined to make it down to the main highway before the night swallowed the last traces of daylight. About 30 minutes into my drive, the sky was completely dark, and the dense forest seemed to press in on both sides of the road. My headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating the winding path ahead. That's when I saw him. The man was standing by the side of the road, his figure barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, and he had a backpack slung over one shoulder. His thumb was outstretched in the universal hitchhiking gesture. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake. Picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of the forest at night was the kind of thing that screamed bad idea, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that leaving him out there was worse. What if he was stranded? What if he needed help? Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. As I rolled down the passenger window, the man approached the car, his movements slow and deliberate. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his voice was calm and even. "Thanks for stopping," he said. "I just need to get to the next town." I nodded, unlocking the door. "Sure. Hop in." He climbed into the passenger seat, setting his backpack on the floor by his feet. I glanced at him as I pulled back onto the road. He looked to be in his late 30s, with short, dark hair and sharp features. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed straight ahead. For the first few miles, we drove in silence. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was coming from and where he was headed, but his answers were short and vague. "Just passing through," he said, his voice flat. I let the conversation drop, focusing on the road instead. The silence in the car felt heavy, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. As we continued down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man sat unnaturally still, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It was as if he wasn't really there, like he was lost in some distant thought. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange. The man hadn't moved, at all. Not to adjust his seatbelt, not to shift in his seat, not even to scratch his face. His stillness was unnerving, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You okay?" I asked, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't respond at first, and I thought he hadn't heard me. But then, without turning his head, he spoke. "You ever feel like you're being followed?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Without a word, he handed it to me. I glanced at it briefly before focusing back on the road. The paper was covered in strange symbols and words I didn't recognize, written in jagged, uneven handwriting. It looked like some kind of code or a message, but it made no sense. "What is this?" I asked, my voice uneasy. "It's a warning," he said. I didn't know how to respond. The man's tone was calm, almost too calm, and the weight of his words sent a chill down my spine. I folded the paper and set it on the dashboard, determined to focus on getting to the next town as quickly as possible. But then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a pair of headlights appeared behind us, distant but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was just another car heading in the same direction. But as the minutes passed, the lights didn't get closer or farther away. They stayed the same distance, following us with an unnerving precision. "You see it too, don't you?" the man said, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded, my hands tightening on the wheel. "Who is it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned in his seat, looking back at the lights. For the first time since he'd gotten in the car, I saw a flicker of emotion on his face. It was fear. I pressed down on the gas, hoping to put some distance between us and whoever was following. The car behind us didn't speed up or slow down, it just stayed there, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin eyes watching our every move. "Turn here," the man said suddenly, pointing to a narrow dirt road that branched off the main highway. I hesitated. "Why?" "Just do it," he insisted, his tone sharp. Against my better judgment, I veered onto the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust as we left the highway behind. The headlights behind us disappeared, swallowed by the trees. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief. But it didn't last. The dirt road twisted and turned through the forest, the trees pressing in on both sides. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires. The man sat stiffly in his seat, his eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. "They won't stop," he said, more to himself than to me. "Who won't stop?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his backpack and pulled out something that made my blood run cold, a long, serrated knife. "Pull over," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. I froze, my heart pounding. "Why?" "Just do it," he repeated. "Now." Terrified, I complied, pulling the car to a stop on the side of the road. The man got out, the knife clutched tightly in his hand. He stood there for a moment, scanning the darkness, before stepping into the trees. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. Minutes passed, and the men didn't return. The forest was silent, the shadows deep and unyielding. Then, in the distance, I saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, their silhouettes barely visible in the faint moonlight. There were 3 of them, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I slammed the car into gear and sped down the dirt road, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally dared to look back, the road was empty. The men, the figures, the lights, everything was gone. To this day, I don't know who or what I picked up that night. But sometimes, when I'm driving through the forest, I catch a glimpse of headlights in the distance, always following, never overtaking. And I can't shake the feeling that one day, they'll catch up to me.